Welcome back to Outside the System. In this episode, I had the pleasure of speaking with Aleks Svetski, a longtime Bitcoiner and the founder of the Bitcoin Times. While our conversation largely centered on Bitcoin, we spent most of the time talking about related ideas, like mass adoption and why Aleks believes it will take 3 generations to get there. Merchant tools, Bitcoin circular economy, time preference, and much more were discussed. Aleks has done a lot of thinking and writing about these topics, and you can find links to all of his content in the show notes. If you're enjoying Outside the System, a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts is super helpful in helping to spread the word. And of course, if you're getting value from the show, you can support us financially using Bitcoin on Fountain or any other podcast player that supports Podcasting 2.0. Let's get into the episode. Aleks, thanks for coming on Outside the System today.
Thank you, brother. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, I've been following you for a while, looking at your work. I know you're kind of legendary on Twitter, Bitcoin circles.
Oh, good.
But yeah, so maybe the best place to start is just kind of introduction on yourself, the kinds of things that you're working on, what you've been doing, and we'll kind of go from there. I have so many topics I want to talk to you about.
For sure, man. So do you want me to give some background, or do you want me to?
Yeah, just some background on you, like what you've been working on, what you've done, and yeah, what people should know about you.
Yeah. I think most people probably know me from a content creation standpoint. And it's funny because I've never really been a content creator. It just sort of happened in Bitcoin because I started ranting on Medium, actually. So I mean, I've always written for myself, but I never wrote in public, and it was really around the time I discovered Bitcoin. I had just started writing some other stuff on Medium, and I can't even remember what my motivation was back then when I started. Honestly, I always thought, like, putting your ideas out in public was a bit weird and dorky. That's why I never really had social media. Like, I never got onto Twitter until like 2018, 2019. And anyway, yes, for some reason I did, and then I got sort of captured by Bitcoin and sort of everything that's important about it, and alongside setting up a company there, because that was how I thought I was going to really impact the space, right? So I set up the world's first Bitcoin-only dollar cost averaging app called Amber, and it inspired a whole wave of these things like Swan and River and everything, and it's funny, like now we have Bitcoin-only VCs, Bitcoin-only companies, Bitcoin-only accelerators, like we have all this cool shit that's come up, but back then, like running a Bitcoin-only company was like, bro, what the fuck's wrong with you? Like, don't you know that it's, cryptocurrency and blockchain, like that's where all the money was. So it was crazy. But yeah, like I set up that company and I just did a bunch of writing. So most people know me probably more from writing than from entrepreneurial stuff. But that's really been more my history, my life, and experience. And anyway, I sort of stepped away from the entrepreneurial thing about 18 months ago, roughly, because let's just say I had a disagreement with the regulators back home in Australia. And I thought the best thing for me was to just move away from that stuff. I don't want to build a company that's about complying. And I'm not a very compliant person either. So yeah, I actually went and tried to double down on the content stuff. So I wrote the Uncommunist Manifesto with Mark Moss, which did pretty well. Like it got out there. We got it into some circles, and I think that
Yep.
was great. And I did the Bitcoin Times, which basically was something that I was doing as like a little side hobby for a number of years, and then I kind of formalized it with the Austrian edition last year. Had like Seyfedin, Pierre. I got Michael Goldstein out of hibernation to write his first piece in years, and it was fantastic. And I finally printed out the first versions of it as a collectible. So there's like 2,100 of each edition that'll ever be printed, and they're uniquely numbered on the back and yada yada yada. So I did that, and I'm just about I'm sort of 30% of the way through editing my next book, which is called The Bushido of Bitcoin, and that's we'll touch on that during the conversation. And yeah, now I'm sort of helping out a couple Bitcoin companies, one in particular called Lucent Labs out of Austin, and I'm working on a little generative AI kind of like side hustle on the side. So yeah, lots going on, bro.
Lots going on. Actually, on your so with your company Amber, right?
Hmm.
Um, you mentioned staying Bitcoin only in that era, which I remember it was probably insane to be considered Bitcoin only at that time. Even though I think in hindsight, now everyone says, "Oh, it's so obvious," right? But at the time, there was
Hmm.
it was really hard. How I guess how did you go about doing that? Because I think there's so many people in the Bitcoin space, particularly not everyone, obviously. Some people were able to kind of stay true and stay to only Bitcoin. But I think there's, money is very hard for people to turn down.
Hmm.
How did you look at that decision? I'm sure people had kind of come to you and been like, well, what about all the other, what we would now call shit coins? Why can't I buy through your app?
Man, we were always on the I mean, as an entrepreneur, you're always battling that, right?
Yep.
It's I had the Dash Foundation offer me a lot of money to list Dash and make it like a Dash app. I was speaking with the Ethereum guys, Consensus and stuff like that. And originally the app almost was a Bitcoin and Ethereum, right? But I don't know, man. There was always a part of me which was like, "Fuck, why am I doing this?" And I always came back to the sort of idea. It's like, well, I'm trying to solve a problem, and the problem is that global savings is broken, and Bitcoin's the only thing that actually solves this. Um, like I wanted to do it because I gave a fuck, and yeah, man. In the end, I just sort of stuck with that, and the more I went down the rabbit hole, obviously, the more of a maxi I became. And the more of a maxi I became, then the easier it was to do that. But in the early days, I was, particularly when money was hard to find. Fuck, man, like I was seriously considering it, because we were broke. We had no money. Like in the first 6 months of raising capital, everyone was laughing at me because I didn't have a token, and we weren't doing an ICO. They're like, why aren't you doing a token?" I'm like, well,
Right.
because I'm selling fucking equity, bro. Like you're actually getting a piece of a company, not a promise of vaporware. And they're
Right.
like, yeah, but we want a token. I was like, fuck me. And then in the second 6 months, Bitcoin had fucking tanked and it was all over, and it was $3,000, and then everyone was laughing at me like, what are you talking about? Didn't you know Bitcoin's dead? Like it's blockchain that we're interested in, the underlying technology. I was like, oh, for fuck's sake.
This brings up a really good point, right? That and you've mentioned this before in your writing, but Bitcoin is sure it's a technology, but not just a technology. Uh, it's really, I mean, so much more than that. I mean, can you expand on that a little bit? Because I think that probably ties into your, I'm guessing your motivation and your kind of becoming a maxi in general, right? Is because I've noticed that for myself as well. It's the more you look at this stuff, it's you come into it, you think everybody comes into it from a different angle. But I know when I first heard about it, it was more from people in tech, and I'm in tech as well, and so it's just learning about it through that perspective. But as you go down the rabbit hole, you're like, you start looking at sound money and all the things that kind of come along with that and the fiat world, and you just start seeing uh it's endless. It's endless once you start
Mm.
going into the rabbit hole. Yeah, so
It is.
I guess, yeah, maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, like so I've always been a curious person, right? And I think a lot of Bitcoiners, fundamentally are. And I guess you need to have a predisposition for asking larger questions. And and that was sort of, I think, what captivated me about Bitcoin is the more I dug, the more I realized, holy shit, money is pretty fucking foundational. And if that's not functional, like you get basically like deviations and distortions and everything downstream. Um, so the more you sort of dig into that idea, the more you realize how profound something like Bitcoin is, and then you obviously find all the million different sort of analogies and parallels with energy, with time, Austrian economics and all this sort of other shit, and you get to the point where it blows your mind so many times that you're like, holy fuck, this is huge. And I think you've also got to have some sort of leaning towards I don't know, doing what's right, um, and like probably placing integrity and honor above money or something like that, because
Yep.
Bitcoin is it's sort of like the boring straight and narrow path. And I've asked myself multiple times. I'm like, fuck, maybe I should have just like rolled a shit coin, printed a bunch of money out of thin air. I'd be sitting on a fat stack. I would have swapped it to Bitcoin, knowing that Bitcoin's a better thing to do anyway. And I wouldn't have had all the stress, all the headache, and everything like that. But then I sort of, think, well, I actually built character in this process, and I think that counts for more. Like that, there's stuff that's immaterial, that matters in life that we kind of disregard, and we end up trading for material gain. And I think that's a larger problem in civilization today, and something I try and tackle in the Bushido of Bitcoin. But um, yeah, anyway, I think you need to have some certain predispositions to avoid that, to sort of really grasp Bitcoin and then sort of stick with Bitcoin.
Right.
And that's it's not a lot of people like that, I think.
Yeah, and I think I mean, this comes through in your writing, and I think in some other people I've also read talk about this, where you're kind of looking at Bitcoin through a much more long time horizon lens, right? You're not looking at, hey, what is Bitcoin going to do in terms of price in the next 6 months? That's not the game that I think people who've really bought into the Bitcoin philosophy and just Bitcoin. When I say Bitcoin philosophy, I actually should just say Bitcoin. It's not really any kind of extra philosophy. It's just if you understand and believe in kind of what Bitcoin represents, uh, there are certain principles that kind of go along with that. And so you've written recently, actually, there's an article you wrote about this 3 generation theory, and you
Hmm.
say Bitcoin is going to reach mass adoption in kind of roughly 2069, and the way you got to that number is a generation is roughly 20 years. Bitcoin kind of started in 2009, so 2009 to 2029, that's generation one. Generation two is to 2049. Generation three is to 2069. Can you
Hmm.
talk about that a little bit? Because I think there's some people might look at 2069 and say, wow, that's so pessimistic. If it's going to take that long to mass adoption, we're screwed. And other people might say, wow, you're crazy. Mass adoption will never happen. So just kind of talk about how you got to that number and kind of what you mean by this 3 generation theory.
Yeah, I think I'd try and lay it out at the beginning of the article and just say, look, Bitcoin quit projecting technological adoption curves onto Bitcoin, because it's so much more. Like the the very nature of money is being changed, and money forms the basis of all of civilization. Like trying to swap it out uh, and change the very fabric of society is like it's a fucking long process. It's a full paradigm shift. Like Bitcoin is incompatible with anything that came before it, right? Like Bitcoin operates on UTXO sets and public private key pairs and addresses, right? Like the everything else that we've conceptualized in the past operates off like account numbers, and double ledger accounting and all that sort of stuff. So like we like that kind of a shift is cultural. It is political. It is social. It is structural. To the very like I don't know, to the very substrate of how civilization operates. And if you think people are all of a sudden gonna change, like how they view money, like let me give you an example. This is hard to explain because it's what I'm trying to reinforce is like how big this thing is. I've been to 40 countries in the last couple of years, and whenever I talk to people about Bitcoin, generally the first thing is they say one of two things. It's, oh yeah, I've invested in that, or no, I haven't invested in that. It's too expensive, right? And
Mhm.
either option shows you where Bitcoin actually is in the cycle. It's like, have you ever heard someone say, "I invest in US dollars"?
No.
No, like, or I invest in euros. Like, no, that's not what they fucking do. So the, they don't even know that it's fucking money. Like, Bitcoin is perceived as some sort of speculative instrument.
Yeah,
Now
they're
that's
treating it like a stock or something like that.
correct. People still perceive it's like, oh, can I buy shares in Bitcoin? It's like, well, bro, it's not a company. but
Yeah.
that's going to take a long time to shift. And prior generations are just not going to get it. So my whole argument is that it's going to require the the boomers basically to die off, and probably us to die off as well, honestly, before the paradigm fully shifts. And each generation is just going to fundamentally bring with it a new understanding or new view of Bitcoin, right? So imagine
Yep.
us in the first generation, like we're the infection stage, like Bitcoin's sort of getting in there and it's forming a virus and host symbiosis. And to do that, the virus needs to enter relatively uninhibited and unnoticed, which it did. It needs to kind of grab a foothold into the system, which it did with what do you call it, Silk Road, and sort of prove usefulness of something within the host. And then it's got to, you know, modern society is fundamentally an economic beast. So what does it need to do? Bitcoin needs to become an economic thing in order to really intertwine with the host, and that's what it's been doing for the last, largely 10 years, really now. And it was originally just pure fucking degenerate gambling, and it inspired more degenerate gambling. But then within that degenerate gambling sort of space, it became the reserve asset within crypto, right? And then, another couple of years, you sort of had a guy called Michael Saylor come out and, say that he's putting it on his balance sheet. So it became, you know, a a reserve asset with a higher degree of trust. Now, by no means is it a broad reserve asset. Like, most people, as I said, still view it as a speculative thing, which is why it still trades risk on. But it's sort of maturing and evolving through these stages. So in this infection stage, it's going to be primarily viewed as a speculative thing until there's enough liquidity um, and a decreased enough volatility for that perception to change, coupled with a new generation that comes in that are the entrepreneurs builders of the new generation. Um, imagine the kids that sort of come 2030 and beyond, like they're going to be 20, 21 years old, etc., coming of age, being entrepreneurs and career people, etc., building stuff. They're not going to know, first of all, of an age before Bitcoin because they were born with Bitcoin. But then also they will have hit that age where they're prone to speculation and stuff like that, when Bitcoin's two orders of magnitude probably larger in price and liquidity than we are now, which will come with a dampening of volatility. So like imagine
Right.
Bitcoin is like a couple $1,000,000 or whatever in 2030. You got cents at parity at that point. Like Bitcoin's movements will just fundamentally not be as wild. That just happens with maturity and it happens with liquidity. So they won't view Bitcoin as the same speculative instrument that as we do, because it will have transformed into something else. So they'll view it more as a tool, and because it's superior in so many ways, and because these young minds will not have been infected the same way as we have with like understanding economics and accounting and finance and everything through old primitives, they'll view like UTXO sets, 10-minute blocks, transparent ledger, all this sort of stuff, like as better primitives upon which they can build better infrastructure. And that's what they'll go and do. They'll go and build new fucking infrastructure that makes more sense and that leverages uh, this this technology essentially, or this new socioeconomic uh, you know substrate, and they'll go and do that. They'll get a lot of pushback. There'll be a lot of competition because obviously the state is going to be building its own set of primitives, and Silicon Valley will be building their own. China will be building their own. Africa will be. Everyone's going to be building their own. But you'll have a whole cohort building on and around Bitcoin, and building better, sounder, more useful infrastructure. And that'll run the course. And then we get to sort of the generation that comes of age, 2050 and beyond, which is our children's children, and they will definitely not know of an age before Bitcoin. Like for them, like that's all there is, and for them, you'll have, obviously, Bitcoin by that stage might be another couple orders of magnitude larger. The concept of Bitcoin will even be foreign. Like for them, it'll be dealing with Sats basically. Like that's we'll probably have dollar Sat parity, and for them, like the utility phase comes in. You have then infrastructure, and
It becomes
utility.
much more about what you can do.
Exactly, and then you know you sort of picture that world. That world might be one in which Bitcoin's competing with different CBDCs and maybe like small Ethereum land or something like that, and fucking China coin or whatever. And that one will be where the showdown sort of occurs with respect to what's better global fucking money. But we ain't getting to global money with Bitcoin before that. Like it's gonna,
Yeah,
gonna fight
there's
that.
yeah, that battle is probably not for our time. We're in a different phase of the process.
Totally, totally.
There's a famous quote which you're probably familiar with, by Max Planck about science advancing one funeral at a time.
Mm,
Um, and
mm.
there's a follow up to it, which I just looked up, which actually is just as relevant to what you're talking about, where he said, in addition to the science advances one funeral at a time, he said, a new scientific truth does not triumph by convincing its opponents and making them see the light, but rather because its opponents die and a new generation grows up that is familiar with it.
Perfect. I wish I put that in the article because that's like literally what I was thinking.
Yep. Yeah, I mean it's so true. It's like I mean this is personal anecdote, but I am going to your point about going visiting different countries. I'm visiting Kenya in this summer, and I'm doing a safari, and so I just had to send money to the person who's booking the safari, and they were doing wire transfer, and it's like they could save themselves fees. I could save myself fees if we just all used Bitcoin, but they're not familiar with it. But probably someone doing this in 20 years or 10 years might say somebody another person who's doing the safaris may say, okay, well, I can just accept Bitcoin for this, not pay the fees on my side. And to your point about infrastructure, maybe there's a tool that they can actually accept Bitcoin without me having to pay Bitcoin. Uh, and it just does a conversion in the back end and kind of makes it much more frictionless for them. But I think merchants, there's two things about Bitcoin that I think are good for merchant adoption. And I've done a lot of like merchant work in previous jobs that I've had on the tech side. This is like many years ago, but uh, two features of Bitcoin that I think are super valuable for merchants. One, the lack of fees, right? So think about credit cards and wire transfers. All of these things have fees, and most consumers don't realize that merchants are the ones paying those fees on their end to accept your credit card payment or your fiat payment. And then the second thing is the instant settlement. Like if you send a invoice, through Stripe or something, there's a settlement process which takes, can take several days, can take even longer.
Mhm.
You use Lightning or use Bitcoin, you're just reliant on, a few minutes, basically. You got settlement, you can use those funds.
Totally, totally. I mean, there that reminds me of like what we're trying to do at Lucent Labs. So I recently joined an Austin startup called Lucent Labs. And people can look it up on Twitter, Labs with a Z at the end. And the mission there is to basically build out a suite of tools to help businesses onboard onto Bitcoin. And there's a million Bitcoin tools out there at the moment, but what I think is lacking, and what intrigued me about these guys was most business owners don't have the time to sit down and watch a fucking YouTube clip about how to set up a node or a wallet or any of that.
Yeah,
They ain't gonna do that.
no way.
Second of all, if someone off the street comes into their establishment and says, "Hey, I'll set you up on Bitcoin. I'll do it for free," blah blah. They don't appreciate that. They sort of automatically red flags go up. Something sketchy is going on, etc. Right? But if they've got an organization they can call that's professional at onboarding onto Bitcoin, um, that can help give them a Bitcoin operations framework. So another thing that Lucent's working on is called the BitOps framework. Um, so they help them get onboarded, handle it all, and then give them a framework within which to operate, and either manage treasury payments, whatever they want that helps enhance their fucking business, because people want to know, how can this help my business and how can this increase my bottom line, how can this lower friction, right? Do that, and then have someone that can be on call when the business needs a bit of assistance in, like, I want to add this, I want to do this, I want to change this broke or whatever, right? That doesn't exist at the moment, at least not to a decent degree, right? There's like random consulting things going around and stuff like that. So anyway, like, this is how we get merchant adoption. Like, we provide them something professional that they can, like, because once again, we talk about Bitcoin trustlessness, blah blah blah, but I'm sorry, the world operates on trust. Trust is a 100,000-year-old primitive. It's not going away tomorrow. Just someone wrote a program that is trustless. Like the fact is, people like 99.9% of people don't understand the white paper anyway, and 99.99999% of people don't understand the Bitcoin code. So it's never going to be trustless. They're just going to trust someone who understands something better than they do. So we just build new pyramids of trust, right?
Of
Um,
course, of course, and I think the like parallel is, I mean, how many people understand how central banking works? It's
mm,
not
mm,
very many, right? And you don't need to understand it to use U.S. dollars or the euro or anything like that. You just use the money, and I think with Bitcoin, we need to get to a point, and I think to your point of how far away mass adoption is, you shouldn't need to understand that to use the money.
mhm,
Uh,
mhm.
so yeah, just making it more simple. And to your point about merchants, I mean, yeah, they're very like a small business owner, whether they operate a coffee shop or something else. The demands on their time are pretty high, and you're right, they're not going to spend their time trying to set up a node or something like that. But they would. To be fair, they also wouldn't watch a YouTube video on how to set up a credit card terminal. They trust a company like Square or Visa or whoever to help them set that up. Your one question going back to the three generation theory, you mentioned kind of in the third phase is where kind of the real showdown happens, probably between CBDCs, Bitcoin, and kind of some of the alternatives. Um, Thinking about kind of even getting to that phase, what are and if this is kind of outside the scope of what you've thought about, we can skip over this question, but it's something I've been kind of thinking a little bit more about these days is how would the state fight back against kind of losing the monetary monopoly? Because it's probably, if not their biggest, one of their top two. Probably, I would actually say their biggest tool right now. Because everything is kind of downstream of that. You can't really fund the defense infrastructure or the attack infrastructure without the fiat money that they rely on. So, to me, it feels like they're not going to let go of that easily.
Well, they're not, and I mean, it's a different fight at a different stage, right? So, and this is sort of why it's really important for the infection stage to play out. And the infection stage to play out, Bitcoin needs to find that symbiosis with the host and be an economic beast that the host itself sees relevance in protecting, right? Until such time that the virus is too integral to it that in order to kill it, the host has to kill itself, right? And that's sort of I think we're right in the fucking guts of that right now, right? Bitcoin is probably too economically important to kill, but simultaneously too complicated to kill without the host damaging itself to a significant degree, right? Maybe we're not, at that point yet, but we're probably close, or perhaps we've passed it. I don't know. But like the whole there seems to be some shenanigans, with the shutting down of Silvergate and Signature
Yep.
Bank, etc. So there seems to be some stuff. We saw the dum dums in China like try and hit it with a hammer by banning mining and all that sort of stuff. You know, so much for that.
China's banned Bitcoin, dozens of times now. So,
Yeah, yeah. So
yep.
like their strategies are pretty like proving to be pretty impotent, right? But
Right.
they're gonna never underestimate and never underestimate your enemy, right? Like every time they fail, they'll think of something else.
Yep.
They'll find another potential weakness. Now, I don't know like what future attacks will look like and how violent and ugly it'll get. Whether the attacks turn more against Bitcoiners themselves, or whether the system itself starts to break up to such a degree, which is like we saw over the last couple of years how little brain cells the lemmings have, right?
Yeah.
The average person, and you still see it. Like this motherfucker's still wearing masks out on the street, like walking around. Like I just beyond comprehension for me when I see that. I'm like I is there an entity inside there? Like, are
It's
you?
mind boggling.
Yeah, like people like that have agency, right? So those people, think about what's going to happen with those people when, because the government printed a bunch of money, because they just bailed out another bank, because of all this sort of stuff, like unbeknownst to them, the price of food's going to go up, the price of gas is going to go up, the price of power is going to go up, the price of everything's going to go up. Who do you think they're going to blame? Do you think they're going to blame the government? No, they can't do. Usually they're government cucks, so they're probably going to blame the people that are getting rich, at least in their eyes, and that's most
Yep.
likely going to be Bitcoiners because we were smart enough to preserve our purchasing power by moving out of other stuff into Bitcoin. So maybe the government doesn't need to attack us directly, but we become a scapegoat, and maybe that's a future attack vector, right? And maybe that's something that our children and children's children are going to need to worry about as the wheels sort of fall off the legacy system. So warfare is going to change big time.
Yep. Yeah, and I think so. That's an interesting segue. The kind of the mask conversation and some of the state fighting back. I think just one last note on that is you're starting to see, to your point about Silvergate and some of the other things that have happened in the last few weeks. They're trying to take off. It appears at least the the on and off ramps from fiat to Bitcoin, or at least make those harder or choke them a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I almost wonder how that's going to almost kind of incentivize actually creating more of a Bitcoin economy, right? If it's harder to get sats on and off,
Yeah.
then it's okay. What can I just buy with my Bitcoin instead of converting my Bitcoin to fiat to actually spend it? Uh, I mean, in some ways, they're almost gonna, like, to your point about a virus. This almost helps the virus replicate faster.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, most of the time, this is sort of, if you're familiar with the Cobra Effect, right? Like most of the time, these idiots shoot themselves in the foot, which is. Do you want to tell you what the Cobra Effect is, or do you know what it is?
Yeah, I don't know what it is. No, yeah, I'd love for you to explain that.
So when the Brits sort of took over India and stuff like that, there was I think it was in the 1800s or something. There was too many cobras out in the streets, so they put out they're like, okay, how do we fix this? All right, let's put out a bounty. Everyone who kills a cobra and brings in a head gets paid, and this will get rid of the cobra problem. So they did that, and people started to kill the cobras, bring them in. But then some people were like, you know what, fucking, I'm going to breed cobras and then just chop the heads off and bring them in. So all of a sudden there was all these cobras coming in, and they were like, well, fuck me, now we've just incentivized the wrong thing. So then they cut the incentive off. So then all these people that were breeding cobras, they're like, well, fuck, now I don't need cobras, so they let them go. So now what ended up happening, they had 10 times more cobras than what they started with. So this is
Wow.
that's the perpetual problem of government, right? Every time they try and fix a problem, they put their foot up and make it 10 times worse, and that backfires on them, all the time. And if, like, another sort of thing from Sun Tzu, right? It's like, don't interrupt your enemy while they're defeating themselves, and that's sort of the position we're in. Is like the government's going to continue to do shit that'll play into our hand, and we just need to stay steady. And this is where I sometimes get pissed off with like the core devs and everyone trying to like fucking do drive chains and tarot and this and that. It's like, man, we don't need to like Bitcoin's a string. You don't push it. Bitcoin gets pulled into the Overton window by virtue of the fact that the paradigm we're living in is so fucking broken and retarded. Like you don't have to impose. You don't have to add new features and do all this sort of shit to Bitcoin. Um, because we're going to win just by being there, like just
Just
by
by existing. Yep.
that's it. Um, and the risk is like by fucking around with adding stuff and doing all that sort of stuff is that you know we might impact or change Bitcoin in such a way that we're not there. When the moment of like or the period of collapse really starts to occur, like that would be a fucking tragedy. Like if
Yep.
Bitcoin doesn't change and doesn't do a single fucking thing different for the next 50 years, that is actually what's going to give people the faith in Bitcoin. That's the couple of generations that it needs. But if Bitcoin changes to such a degree, or we set the precedent that we can change it whenever we fucking want to, um, then we might actually have a real problem. We might have gained a couple, technical features which don't really matter much because once again, nobody's using the shit. Nobody actually cares. But in hindsight, what we'll have done is set a precedent for change, which then defeats the very purpose of Bitcoin's existence, and that's it's very dangerous.
That's such a good point because every day basically that goes by that Bitcoin stays the same and maintains itself and stays up, and just builds more and more of a track record is actually a win and makes it sounder money and makes it more convincing that it
Mm-hmm.
will. I guess every day, every year that goes by makes it more likely it will exist in a year,
Exactly.
right? Yeah. Um, yeah. So that actually makes complete sense. And yeah, I hadn't thought about all the dev wars or battles that happen in that context. But I think that's so important because you're right. You might gain something in the short term while kind of going back to Sun Tzu, like we've been kind of alluding to this whole time. You might win the battle and lose the war basically
Totally.
by
Totally.
doing that. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah. You don't need to compete with Ethereum or with some of the others that are out there. You just need to do your thing
Yeah, that's it. And
and
like,
continue.
and
Yep.
like I always say, like Ethereum's number one use case is that it, got all the idiots and tinkerers over onto Ethereum. Like, let them fuck around.
Yeah. That's such a good way of putting it. Yeah, it gives them a playground and they can stay out of Bitcoin.
That's it.
Um, so you were mentioning like the era that we live in, and I want to spend a couple minutes on that because I do think to your point about how 'cause I felt this when I went down the Bitcoin rabbit hole as well. You start realizing how much is actually downstream of money, and that's actually basically everything about civilization because it's our value, it's how we indicate value.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
uh, and so sometimes you see our era and there's a lot of obviously fucked up things that are around us, and we don't have to go through each and every one, but I do think sometimes and this is like in my calmer days. There's plenty of days where I'm like angry and all riled up about it, but on my calmer days I'm like, a lot of this is actually downstream of us fucking up the money,
uh-huh.
and people not being educated, or people focusing on the wrong things, and that's just kind of how it is. Do you see that changing in, let's say we have 3 generations in the future, Bitcoin wins? How does that change the world in a non-monetary way, right? Like, so I'm talking like morals, values, day-to-day life. Like, have you kind of thought that far ahead about
Yeah.
what that changes? And I think some of it ties into Bushido, but
Mm-hmm.
yeah, you kind of take it there too if you want.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, let's answer in two parts. So Bitcoin's effect comes in the form of altering or improving time preference, right? So time preference is at the center of kind of how humans decide on their mode of behavior, right? So behavior is determined by time preference, and what that means is, and maybe for those who don't understand what time preference is, maybe I'll preface that first. Time preference is the difference in valuation between the present and the future, right? So how much do you value the present over the future? Okay, you'll never value the future more than the present because it's just not how things work. Like, having food now is more than potentially having food in the future. Having $10 now is better than having potentially $10 in the future. So the present is always more valuable. What you then need to think about is like, okay, how much more valuable, right? And what's the relationship between the two? So on one end of the spectrum, you have, I value the future zero and I'm completely in the present. And that's like generally leads to some form of hedonism or nihilism or, just pure, current bliss. People on heroin are very, don't care about the future because they're in current bliss at the moment, but they're not really functional members of society, right? And then you have on the other end of the spectrum people who have like extraordinary fucking time preferences, super long time frames, etc., and then they never actually experience anything today, right? But going both extremes is obviously not healthy. Now the thing is the the more you can value the future and the more you can delay gratification essentially, and the more you can lower your time preference, i.e. increase the value of the future in relation to the present, um, the more you can sort of plan for and think about tomorrow, the more you can actually optimize for cooperation, the more you can create certainty for tomorrow. And money plays into this big time because money is the thing that gives you optionality and certainty today for tomorrow, right? Like if you can store some money today, you can then acquire the goods you need for your survival or for your thriving tomorrow or the day after. If you can't do that, then you have to consume everything today. And this is sort of, time preference is so integral to behavior that, you could really trace all of the poor behavior, or a lot of the majority of the poor behavior today, back to weak money. Essentially, is money that incentivizes consumption or gambling. Right? That's the other big problem, is that people, are in such a position that the money is so worthless that they can't save for the future, so they have no optionality. So they, and they're tired of potentially consuming so much that they're like, "Fuck it, I need to take big bets because that's the only way that I can create any sort of certainty in the future." So they take on massive uncertainty to get certainty, and then they fuck up, or maybe they don't fuck up, and they think that that's how you're supposed to win, and then all of society starts to skew and turn into a gambler society. And that's sort of, we have a bit of both. We have consumption and gambling. And I think when people talk about Bitcoin fixes this is actually what they're talking about. Seyfedin wrote a fantastic piece called "Making Time Preference Low Again" in last year's edition of the Bitcoin Times, and people should pick up a copy of that because they'll get his piece and everything else in there. But it's one of his best pieces. Like it's not written anywhere else. He wrote it just for this, and it digs into this idea of the relationship between behavior and Bitcoin in a deep way. And then second to that is what I tried to dig into in Bushido of Bitcoin, which was more a question of, okay, Bitcoin really sets the foundation for it. So it's then how do you then excel on a Bitcoin standard? What are the virtues that we must inculcate into ourselves in order to excel on such a standard? And what I did was I looked at um, the warrior cultures over the last couple millennia. So everything from like the Spartans to the Thebans to the Macedonians um, to the Arthurian knights to the samurai, of course, hence the name. And I dug into like what made these warrior cultures great and strong, because warrior cultures are where the strongest virtues actually come from, because they're in those environments are where you're kind of operating with the highest stakes, right? Like it's pure life or death. There's no greater stakes like you know going to battle with your people, against other people, and sort of hand to hand combat, blood, sweat, piss, shit, right in front of you. Like they're different stakes than sort of what we understand in the normal world. So surviving in that sort of environment requires really the best possible virtues. So anyway, I looked at that, and that's sort of an addendum. But you if you only do that piece without fixing the money, you can get a long way, but inevitably you'll be economically disadvantaged, which is why the samurai, for example, were ultimately defeated, right? By the West. You'll if you lose that economic advantage, you'll basically lose the battle. So if you fix
So I'm actually not familiar with that history of that. Yeah, I was kind of curious. How did their samurai society fall apart?
The West,
Was it?
the West came
Yeah.
and basically partnered with the merchants, and then kind of rugged the samurai, and
Mm,
feudalism overnight basically became illegal because the emperor and the rising merchant class partnered with the West, and basically swords and arrows were obviously not as powerful as guns and cannons.
yep.
And yeah, what was a very peaceful, orderly, structured society sort of got overturned. And within a couple generations, fucking Japan went from being this structured, orderly hierarchy into being, running fucking prisoner of war camps. Like the whole fucking thing inverted. Um, it was there's a whole fascinating thing there, but yeah, like you got to get the money right, and then you need to build the virtues and values on top of that, so you have a foundation. Because if you don't, you're just going to keep doing, the hop cycle, right? Strong men, good times,
Oh yeah.
weak men, bad times, and you're just going to keep doing that cycle. I think Bitcoin allows us an opportunity to short circuit that and build.
Yeah, I do think kind of looking back on this era, maybe from our grandchildren's perspective, it will truly kind of be more absurd than we even realize. Like even people who think it's absurd already, I think looking back will be considered even crazier that you could kind of change the unit of account essentially on the whim of a council of a few people, and then everyone else would be gambling their hard-earned money on whether that small council is going to raise or lower interest rates. Like it's kind of crazy if you really step back and think about it.
Yeah, dude, it's insane. It's insane. People, it's funny. People laugh at how the ancients used to have like shamans and everything like that that would read the entrails of animals and sort of like make decisions and everything. Bro, we haven't changed. Like we're actually worse now because I'm
Not
sure
at all.
there was probably some sort of like heuristics around like astrology and omens and all that sort of stuff. Like there was probably something there, whereas today I guarantee you there's nothing going through the brains of like Yellen and Powell and stuff like that. They're just fucking getting together and like, oh, let's do this today. Why not?
Shooting from the hip. Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I actually used to laugh a lot at like, I don't know, astrology and like people basing things on the moon and like all that. I used to think I mean, I'm an engineer by background, and I used to think, oh yeah, we're so much smarter than that now. But if you think about it, like the moon influences the tides of the oceans, and
Totally,
like
totally.
it's not a trivial thing actually. If you really kind of look at it, you're like, wow, okay, actually maybe there was something there. I don't know. I mean, I don't know enough about it to outright dismiss it. I should put it that way. Whereas I used to outright dismiss it.
Mm-hmm. 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 Totally.
Um, yeah, the shaman thing is so interesting. So I also want to spend a little bit of time on the Uncommunist Manifesto because I actually read it as we were preparing for this episode. So you have a couple sections in there that I want to hit. I mean, it's a great book. I think anyone should read it. It's like also very, very readable and very giftable. I didn't realize like the size of the book when I had bought it,
Mm-hmm.
but it's like small book. I don't remember how many pages, but it's not like you're not asking somebody to read a textbook. So it's an easy book if you kind of want to give someone something and kind of start kind of giving them the mind virus. That of not being a communist.
Yeah.
But one section I want to hit is why is Marxism so attractive to people? You had a section in there about that, and I think that's an important one. So yeah, I guess maybe if you could talk through that, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, for sure. And appreciate the comments about the book. I think, one of the things Mark and I really tried to do was take a bunch of complex ideas and sort of distill them down into 3 or 4 takeaways, really. And yeah, as you said, it's made to be readable and it's made to be giftable for precisely that reason. Because these days, no, first of all, no one fucking reads, and second of all, the few people that do have the time and energy and desire to read, they're not really going to read War and Peace or fucking what do you call it, by Mises, Human Action, right? So we try to take all of that, distill it, and deliver it in something that's under 100 pages. And I think, yeah, I think we did a good job. Not to blow smoke up my own ass, but if people want to grab it, like uncommunist.com, and I think it's useful. So to your point about like why Marx or why Marxism is so attractive, like we battled with this for a while, and it just hit me as we were sort of writing the book, and I was like, you know what, entropy was my answer, and Mark was like, what do you mean? And I said, dude, it's just easier to fucking bring things down than it is to build them up, right? Like if it's easier to beat someone in a race by tripping them over and then like walking past them than it is to really train for 6 months, so that you can be stronger, fitter, faster than they are, right? Like it's easier to, like, instead of getting up and pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, right, and doing all of that, like it's easier to just tear others down. So the very existence of entropy is sort of why I believe Marxism is so appealing, because it makes an academic justification for basically being, an entitled brat. Like that's really if you read the Communist Manifesto, that's essentially his position. He's like, these other people who we don't like, because they have money and capital, we should take it from them, and we should be the allocators of said money and capital, and that's it, because they
It
suck
it
and we're better.
it's also, Alex, I think the other thing that, I mean, is very related to your point about entropy and the entitled brats thing is, for a philosophy that tries to promote itself as being very selfless and, kind of doing this for humanity and equality and all of these kind of so-called noble aims. It's actually a very ego-driven philosophy, because you're essentially saying, I know better than all of you how to allocate this. Like, this other group
Hmm.
doesn't know, we know better. And I think there's a real connection between like scientism and communism. I don't mean science, right? I think like science is different, but scientism
Hmm.
and eugenics as well. I think eugenics is also very kind of connected to a lot of these same ideas.
Yeah, I mean the scientism for sure. I think one of the how do I put this? It's like, I don't know what. Let me say it this way: like during sort of 2020, and 2021 and 2022, you sort of really saw that people who are sort of godless, or atheist and all that sort of stuff, show their true colors. It's like, I don't believe in God, but I believe in government, right? And like, people end up believing in something,
Right.
um, and yeah, you end up getting scientism and all this sort of, like, you can't replace faith. I think in the human psychology, you can't replace belief systems, and religions do a good job generally of like creating some sort of moral hierarchy of virtues and values that people can integrate and embed in their lives. And then that's just not the job of science. It's not the job of being rational. Like, science is concerned with the study of matter, and sort of religion and philosophy are concerned with the study of what matters, right? And they don't overlap very well, because they're just two different realms. And trying to take primitives from one and apply it to the other, doesn't work very well. And that's essentially what happened over the last couple of years, is that you had these people devoid of a moral hierarchy. They basically took science and turned it into scientism, and created their own deities with fucking Fauci at the top or whatever, or Bill Gates was their new god. And they went and, fucking jabbed themselves religiously, every couple months to prove a point. Like, it's just fucking maddening. So, anyway, I don't know.
Yep.
It's a bit of a tangent, but it's, yeah, just to your scientism point.
Yep. Yeah, and I think the another thing you touch on in the book, which is I think not talked about enough, is you make the distinction between cronyism and capitalism,
Hmm. Hmm.
and how a lot of the ills that are attributed to capitalism are actually cronyism, or the Cantillon effect taking shape, showing itself. Talk about that a little bit, because I think that's one of the, it's like a common meme that you'll see like on social media. It'll be, oh, look at, late stage capitalism or whatever, right? And it's like every single time one of those things is happening, it's really, you're talking about cronyism. When people talk about like a congressperson making money off of their trades and, clearly not doing things fully above board, that's not capitalism. That's clearly cronyism. But I don't think people have the vocabulary. Like, most people haven't heard that word, cronyism. So maybe define that and talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, like, maybe first let's define capitalism, right? So, what the hell is capitalism? So, well, first let's define what is capital. And capital, you basically have three base forms of capital. You've got time, you've got energy, and you've got natural resources. So that's sort of the base. And then you have some, higher order capital, like ideas and reputation, like faith, maybe, stuff like that, right? Um, So if you look at what capitalism is, it's the effective and efficient use of that capital, right? So using resources more efficiently and effectively, using time more efficiently and effectively, using energy more efficiently and effectively, like leveraging reputation, leveraging trust, faith, like all that sort of stuff. I don't fucking understand what's wrong with that. Like that is very useful. And then, in a sort of paradigm of capitalism, to be able to use things more effectively and efficiently, you need to have feedback mechanisms, and feedback mechanisms are often, uh, you know, either positive or negative, and it's actually the negative feedback mechanisms that are the ones that actually induce change and adaptability. Right now, what you've got in cronyism is the removal of the sort of the pain receptors or the negative feedback by virtue of just removing consequence from the system, and that's very dangerous to the system as a whole when constituents within the system can get uh, can basically play a game of heads I win, tails you lose, right? Like that's a fucking unfair game, and that's essentially what happens in cronyism. Cronyism is, you know, taking advantage of a system through politics, right? And politics is not capitalism. Like capitalism is not political, right? Capitalism is just a process, and that's something we tried to really make clear in the book. Um, so cronyism is using the political apparatus to to basically privatize gain and socialize loss. And we've seen that so many times, as you said, like a politician of some sort, creating some sort of whether it's regulatory moat, or whether they you know do a Nancy Pelosi and make more money than the Wall Street fund managers, or whatever the fucking case is. That is a way of using political position or political power or something like that to gain an unfair advantage, um, without having suffered the consequence of making poor decisions, right? And cronyism is a sickness because what it does is it actually decays the society, and then people who uh, are not so good at competing, they just give up because they very quickly realize that, you know what, the game is fucking rigged. I'm opting out. I'm out of here. And they become basically an ever growing poor class that is completely dependent on the system. And then you have those who are smart enough to play the game, and what they sort of realize is that, hey, the fucking game's rigged, so I may as well cheat as well because everyone else is cheating. So then you end up getting the upper echelon, the middle class, become more rich because they cheat. So they lose their own moral validity. They sort of decay their own uh, view of themselves because they know they've become scumbags. And but they're richer, and sort of you basically erode the middle class, and you get a bunch of rich nihilistic assholes, and you get a bunch of poor giver uppers, and you hollow out civilization, and then that's kind of like the end state of cronyism, and then we're seeing that firsthand. That is fundamentally not capitalism. Capitalism implies that the actor actually suffers the consequences for their decision making, and this is not what we're seeing. We're missing that, and it's so important to
Yep.
delineate the two.
No, and we've seen it so many times. I mean, if you look at, I mean, banking is the most obvious example, but even things like the vaccines and the pharma companies getting immunity from lawsuits, it's okay, great if, we're going to get all this money for these vaccines, but if it doesn't do what we promised, or if it hurts people, guess what? You can't sue us.
Mm-hmm.
That's definitely not capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
That's using your political power to change the rules. Um, and you see that. I mean, it's not just in these industries. I mean, I think it actually has touched every industry, and every large company employs a lot of lobbyists, and it's probably some of the highest ROI activity that they can do today is
Mm-hmm.
just make sure that they have the right political connections, and kind of can protect yourself from the losses, socialize the losses to your point, and privatize all the gains.
Absolutely.
So I know we're getting close to time here. Would love to talk about Bitcoin Times. I know you've alluded to it a little bit here, but in earlier parts of the episode, but just maybe talk a little bit about the project, what you're doing with it, what's coming soon, and where people can find it.
For sure. So yeah. So like really, kind of an overview maybe for people to understand is I started this thing as a kind of I was giving a talk during the period when I was raising money for Amber, and we had just sort of entered the blockchain space, right? Or maybe actually I'll rewind to right before that. So there was a conference, a capital raising conference that I was going to, and this was sort of 2017, and every dumb motherfucker in there was basically uh, spinning up a token, right? Like companies that had no business in anything to do with cryptocurrency or everything, they were just like spinning up tokens. And I was a crypto company at that point. Like I was still considering doing Bitcoin and Ethereum, but like we were still like fundamentally a Bitcoin company. And I didn't want to do a token because I knew how scammy it was. So I got up on stage and gave this talk about how uh, the AOL blockchains, what did I call it? Crypto's AOL moment or something like that, where basically it was all going to blow up. And I remember like I bifurcated the audience. Like half the audience was like, "Oh my god, thank you so much. You're the first person who got on stage and like made sense. Had no idea what the rest of these fucking idiots were getting up there and talking about tokens for. You just saved me a bunch of money." And then the other half was like, exhibitors and everything saying, "Do you know how much money you cost me, little motherfucker?" Um, and the organizer of the event was like ropeable. He was so pissed off. He said at the end, he's like, "Look, you'll never be invited to any more of our events in the future. Like, please don't come back." I was like, "Okay, go fuck yourself." So anyway, a year passes, and I get a sheepish email from him saying, "Hey, I know I told you all that stuff last year, but like, turns out you were right. This is sort of after ICOs blew up." And he's like, "We had so much good feedback from from your talk. People messaged us later asking if you're going to be talking this year. So look, we'd love you to come back, and don't worry, there's no ICOs this time. We're doing stuff that's real that adds the classic saying, what is it, real world problems. We're solving real world problems." I was like, "Okay, yeah, cool." So they said, "This year's event is a blockchain event," and I was like, "Oh, you got to be fucking kidding me." So I was like, "Yeah, all right, I'll come." And my talk, unbeknownst to them, was "Blockchain is dead. The future is on Lightning." And I remember him being in the back of the room, and I told him when I gave him the title of my talk, I just told him, how Lightning will transform blockchain. So he was like, "Oh, that's cool." But then when I got on stage, I was like, "By the way, the real topic of the talk is blockchain is dead. The future is on Lightning," and his face just went white in the back of the room. Anyway, I gave this talk. It's actually on YouTube. It's a good one. It's called I think it's actually called "Blockchain is Dead. The Future is on Lightning." And it's a 30-minute talk, and I basically just dismantled the idea of blockchain and talked about how Bitcoin and Lightning are gonna basically form the stack of the future. And it was early days, man. There wasn't any wallet or Satoshi or Blue Wallet or any of that sort of stuff at the time. Like Lightning was still very much conceptual. There was a couple of early products, but I sort of knew we were onto something. And I had so much content for that talk that we chucked it all in like a PDF handout that we gave out on the day, and everyone fucking loved it. So what I did was I turned that PDF then, a couple of weeks later into a nice, properly edited, nicely designed PDF that I just posted up on Twitter, and that's kind of one of the early things that really landed me on the map. Like Matt Odell and Marty Bent saw it, a couple other people saw it, and it did the rounds. And basically, it was one of the cornerstone pieces that were Bitcoin, not blockchain, right? Really early on. So then, about a year later, I got together with Gigi, Breedlove, Nick Carter at the time before he went crazy, Dan Held, a couple other people, and I said, "Look, boys, let's I want to do this once a year, and let's put together a series of essays on a particular topic." So we did the sovereignty edition of the Bitcoin Times, and then the year after, I got Parker Lewis, Jeff Booth, Eric Kaysen, Giacomo Zucco, and Jimmy Song, and we did the Promethean edition of the Bitcoin Times, and that was like the one that really sort of spread far and wide. It had 6 fantastic pieces in it. It was it was an inspirational like collection of essays, and that was 2020. It was done in Clown World. I wrote one of my best pieces, I think, Utopian Dystopias, and yeah, that was like really profound. And then 2021, we did A New Hope. And that one I didn't have time to sort of really promote, but that had Alan Farrington, Thomas Strolight, Brennan Quittem, among a couple others, Peter Sinonji and stuff. And that one was like, it kind of took a different tone than the previous year. The previous year was like a little bit angry about like Clown World, obviously. And then, yeah, last year was the first one that I did that was a real thematic. So like it was the Austrian edition, and it was looking at Bitcoin through an Austrian lens and looking at Austrian economics through a Bitcoin lens. And I got the best Austrian minds, Seyfedin, Pierre, Konrad Graf, who was one of the early Austrian economists that picked up on Bitcoin's Austrian nature. Rahim Tagizadagan, who's actually a direct student of Hans Hermann Hoppe. And
Oh wow.
yeah, and Michael Goldstein. Yeah, Rahim is a fucking wealth of knowledge. His essay in there is fantastic. Um, so so yeah, we put that together, and it's a beautiful piece. And like I basically I pay a designer a bunch of money to turn it into something absolutely gorgeous. And what I did last year for the first time was I took them. We created like this iconic sort of numbering system on the back where you've got the knight with a little number on it, and there's sort of copies from 1 of 2100, 2 of 2100, 3 of 2100, all the way to 21 of 2100, which means each edition comes with 2100 prints, and the prints are like actual collectibles. Like they're fucking heavy. They're full on 14-point covers, 100-pound in internal papers, like proper gloss. Like they're real collectibles that'll last 100 years. And yeah, 2100 of each edition. I'm going to do 21 editions in total over 21 years. So we've got 5 editions. 3, 4, and 5 are up for sale. 1 and 2 are being redesigned. But yeah, you can pick them up for some sats at bitcointimes.io. And yeah, they're like each essay is unique to the Bitcoin Times, so you won't find it generally anywhere else. Some of the authors republish on their own stuff, like I know Parker Lewis republished on his Gradually Then Suddenly. I think Goldstein republished on his Substack, but you're not going to find them printed or properly done anywhere else. And that's essentially what these are. So yeah, I had launched it on BitBlock Boom last year, and everyone loved it. Like the 250 that I originally printed all sold out, so now I'm like in the I'm sort of we're between 350 and 500 now, so we're selling those out before we print the next batch. But yeah, it's that's what that is.
Yeah, that's a that's a fascinating project. And then is it just I'll put the link in the show notes, but bitcointimes.io.
That's it. Yeah, yeah.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, I'll definitely put the link there. I'll link to your Twitter as well, because that's always I think you're a pretty fun follow, and you do, it seems like, do a lot of content on whether it's podcasts, and you used to have a podcast as well, which is still available to find if people want to dig in there. I actually listened to a couple of the old episodes, and there's some interesting things in there too.
Thanks.
So I'll link to all of that. Yep, in the show notes.
Appreciate it. Yeah, it's I ended up killing the podcast because I had too many things to do, but I finished off on 100 episodes. So
Yep, I saw. Yeah.
yeah, it was,
Yeah, with Bitcoin Times, the thing that's really interesting about it is, most people kind of treat media as like a short time preference thing, where
mm,
it's okay, I'm doing this thing about current events, or I'm talking about what the Fed did yesterday, or this kind of discardable thing that might be useful for a few days, few weeks at most,
exactly.
and then you let go of it. Yeah.
Yeah, spot on. Like it's, if you look at the website, I talk about quality of quantity and a low time preference publication. Basically, that's the whole point of this thing, is that I want people to, when they buy this, they know that they're, and it's not cheap. Like each edition is roughly like $50, right? But they're an actual collectible that, when you buy this, you're going to hand it down to your children and your children's children. Like they're going to look back on it and be like, man, these motherfuckers were the pioneers, right, of the first generation of Bitcoin. Like that's something special. Like that's something worth buying and spending some sats on.
Yeah, it's one of those things where people will look back and say like, "Wow, I'm descend." People. Sometimes people say, "Oh, I'm descended from one of the people who came
Mm-hmm.
to in the U.S." You hear this at least. People who came to the U.S. on the Mayflower or whatever. It's like,
Okay.
wow, that's freaking cool. So this is like the equivalent of that in the
It
Bitcoin
is.
space.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah, it's that's really interesting. Yeah, so I'll definitely link to that. Go check that out. And yeah, I mean, just seeing like the contributors page, the quality of people you have in the publication is, top notch. Like it's just basically everybody.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I didn't skimp on that shit. Like this year, we're doing the energy edition, and Marty Bent's gonna highlight it. And I haven't announced the other writers yet, but yeah,
Yep.
it's never gonna be like some no namer. It's like someone who's actually made an impact. So yeah, it's definitely the best names.
Yep. Fascinating. Well, Aleks, thanks for coming on. This was so much fun. I think we'll have to do another one in the future, because I think there's, even just looking at my outline, we could go for another hour. So we should plan on that maybe in a few months.
Absolutely, brother. I really appreciate it. You're a great host, and this was a good show.
Yeah. Thanks for joining. It was a lot of fun.